I'm going on that one, right? Oh, there's stairs.
There's stairs.
I thought we were in.
Sam.
I thought we were in the rustic North Woods. Wow, this is uphill.
Good morning.
I feel like I'm
Everybody
slipping
ready?
backwards. Are we slipping? Wow.
Good morning. Welcome to the 6th session of the 2019 Champlain Institute. My name is Lynn Bolger, and I am Dean for Institutional Advancement at College of the Atlantic. I want to also acknowledge our online audience watching through the live stream feed, as well as our listening audience. We welcome you to the conversation. If you are just joining us, the Champlain Institute this year focuses on dissent and diplomacy through the lens of the artist. We have covered a lot of ground this week with talks on how the soft power of cultural diplomacy is used in hard places. That's Kat's turn. And how artists like Bryn Moser and Susan Sarandon use film as activism to shine the light on the issues of our days, like the Syrian refugee crisis. Next up is the dinner table. And while some of you might not think the topic is as serious or weighty or complex as the role of Islamic art to change minds, let me remind you of your Uncle Roger and how you avoided going home for Thanksgiving for 7 years because you couldn't stand another turducken ruined by a conversation about this or that U.S. administration that went really, really wrong. In her article, The Art of the Dinner Party, Gabrielle Hamilton writes, "To me, it has always been clear that a dinner party is about what is said, not what is eaten. There would always be wine and salad and bread and stew, chocolate and fruit, and nuts and sparkling duck. But those were just the props, the conduits for funny and real and meaningful conversation, the set pieces of a lively, engaged, lingering, old-school dinner party." To which I say, right on. The Champlain Institute to me is one big dinner party, and we're glad you're here for this feast of ideas and insights. Here today to talk about real and meaningful conversation over the dinner table is Sam Sifton, the food editor at the New York Times. Previously the paper's national editor, Sam has also worked as deputy dining editor, like what is that? And culture editor. In October 2009, he succeeded Frank Bruni as restaurant critic for the Times. Sam has deep Maine ties, having spent summers here for most of his life. We are thrilled that his son will be attending college in the fall. Sam also graduated from the little liberal arts college in Cambridge that Kat did, called Harvard, a degree in history and literature, 1988. To talk with Sam this morning is Catherine Brown Collins, who spoke on Tuesday about her work at the U.S. State Department on film projects that bring artists from around the world to cities across the country, and U.S. artists and film projects to international audience, all in the name of cultural diplomacy. As it happens, Catherine's stepfather, Johnny Apple, has something or everything to do with Sam being hired at the New York Times. One of these funny coincidences that happen when you put together a forum like this one. Please join me in welcoming Sam and Kat this morning.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And so excited to be back and talking to you. And this is what's amazing is I am meeting you now for the first time.
Which is pretty weird.
It is a little weird because
this connection goes back many, many, many years.
Yes, and I first heard about you through Johnny, but I think the other end of the telephone when you were editing his copy.
So it was interesting editing Johnny. He had this ability to infuriate the copy desk that was unparalleled in the history of the New York Times, and he would fight with them viciously. And I decided that I would step in between, as a backfield editor, I would step in between the copy desk and Johnny, and I would offer edits from the copy desk as if they were my own, so that I would take the fire, and it seemed to lessen his rate. I'll tell one story about Johnny, and then we'll talk about food. He absolutely had to, these were the days when you actually edited the copy to bring lines up if the story ran too long, and so you would trim widows at the end of paragraphs and stuff. So I would have to fax him the copy itself so that he could remove stray adverbs and the like to bring the copy up so that if it was 9 lines over, it would fit in the box that we had. He was on this was during a presidential election cycle. I knew he was in Ohio, a swing state. I didn't know where he was. I couldn't reach Betsy, but I knew he was there. So I called a couple of hotels, and I found him. And he said, "How the hell did you find me?" And I said, "Johnny, there are a limited number of 4-star hotels in the state of Ohio." It only took me 3 calls. He was great. I would not be here without his guidance and instruction. He taught me so much about being a reporter, an editor, and a little bit of a food guy.
Yeah, well, it's so exciting now to meet you and talk about all the amazing things that you are doing right now in New York Times. You were a food editor. You are running this extraordinary website, New York Cooking. You're a columnist. You have had the background of being a critic and a culture edit. I was wondering if we could step out back for a minute, and as we this week are talking about narrative and representation and art, if you could talk, how do you approach food as culture or food as social history, and how is food storytelling?
So food is storytelling from the very beginning of time. As the first person to explain that these, that I hunted and gathered these things for you, and this is where I found this animal and this grain and put it together. And the meal itself will tell the story of its origin. I believe very strongly that food is culture, and I believe that restaurant food can elevate it to a level of almost art. That the art or the business of restaurant criticism is a culturally critical pursuit that is no different from writing about art or writing about literature. And I am really interested in the work that I do in writing about and for home cooks and writing about and occasionally for restaurateurs, how those two things intersect, how craft can be art, how art can be craft, and how we can, all of us, take part in it either as participant and as a home cook, or as a participant observer, as we are when we're in a restaurant kitchen, restaurant dining room.
And in that dynamic, as you were describing, between sort of the home cook and the restaurant, and it's really exciting now that as all the international influences now on cuisine and access to so many different ingredients, and how has this expanded your coverage of what's going on, and because it must make it that much more dynamic, but also challenging of how to curate that?
Oh, it's so liberating, this internet, because what it has done, above all else, the rise of internet shopping and the kind of the expansion of smart purchasing in supermarkets has led us to a point in America where you can get most everything you need within a day or two to make food from almost any cuisine in the world. This is in part because of patterns of migration that have brought people across the United States who don't look like everybody who was there, and markets have responded. You could not conceive of finding lemongrass at the Shaw's in Brunswick, Maine 15 years ago. Now, if you're lucky, it might be there. And if not, bink, you get it on the internet. So our ability to go out into the world and report on global cuisines, whatever that means, I would prefer to say our ability to go out into the world and report on the food that people are cooking and figure out how to bring that home to our readers is wildly expanded by the fact that it's not weird to call for gochujang in a recipe. The Korean hot pepper paste is available in lots and lots of retail locations, and if it's not, you can get it on the internet. Amazing, and so helpful in expanding all of our understandings of what global cuisine really is and what we can bring into our kitchens and put on our tables.
And because you've been writing about food and culture, when did you see, there seems to have been a change in the way that New York Times or food coverage from fine dining, the tablecloth, the very rarefied restaurant atmosphere, the sommelier, to this exciting dynamic of food from other cultures coming in, the noodle shop, the food truck. When did that happen, and how did the New York Times deal with that change?
We raided the Los Angeles Times, and we hired a woman named Ruth Reichel. This is, this is true story. True story. This is in the late 80s, early 1990s. The Times raids the Los Angeles Times and hires its chief restaurant critic, Ruth Reichel, and brings her to New York. The previous restaurant critic was shocked that this woman was going to come in because she was writing in Los Angeles. She had been writing about Wolfgang Puck and his restaurants, but also about restaurants out in the valley that were serving exotic Chinese cuisine and the like. And in one of her first reviews, she gave, I think, a 3-star review to a soba shop in Soho, and which was a bananas good restaurant. I was like, I was in high school, but it was my dad took me there. It was great. Not that I was a critic then; I was a child, but it seemed to me to be a really good restaurant. Brian Miller, who had been the critic, went bananas and wrote a memo that leaked into the gossip page 6 in the New York Post, and he said that she was destroying the star system because of this review. Brian's a great guy, but he had come up in a world where there were really only there's 16,000 restaurants in New York City. There were probably only about 400 that he cared about, or that the New York Times cared about. Craig Claiborne before him, same deal. And those were continental cuisine, white tablecloths, captains and runners, and a maitre d' you palmed $100 on the way in, and so French food mostly, a little bit of Italian. Those days were then over in the early 1990s, and Ruth helped change that. That pace of change accelerated and continues to accelerate, so that now sometimes when you look at if you look at the print paper, and I hope that you do, on Wednesdays and see the restaurant page, sometimes the review on the bottom of the page, the Hungry City review, which is devoted to digging out little Azerbaijani shops in the farthest reaches of Queens that are, serve 11 people, and the top review, the starred review, sometimes those restaurants seem almost indistinguishable. And isn't that exciting?
Yeah.
So that's a very long answer to a very concise question. It started in 90, and here we are.
And there's a lot to cover with what you're trying to do, and you're writing this great newsletter, which I love because it starts off what I should be cooking. I don't. I think you described. I think you rightly described cooking as fantasy.
Yeah.
I have many fantasy dinner parties.
Yeah.
They're fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. But then you take us through sort of what is larger, sort of on the national headlines, and then what you've seen or read in film. And again, I like how you're connecting food and culture, and it's a wonderful combination.
Well,
of what you're
thank
doing.
you. NYTcooking.com. Sign up for that newsletter, please. I hope you will. So it goes out 4 times a week. And I have a specific charge, right? I've gotta sell recipes essentially, right? Like I'm telling you, here are the new recipes that we've come up with, the reporting that went into them, the storytelling that sits behind them. It's this weather on the East Coast. This is what you ought to be eating, or this is the fantasy I want to spin for you. But all through this, I find myself, regrettably, I find myself always on this tightrope. It's a tightrope. It's only a couple inches off the ground, but it's a tightrope nonetheless, where I'm trying to figure out to what extent can I bring into the prose a sense of what's happening in the world right now. Because what's happening in the world right now, the world's a dark and terrifying place right now. And I gotta think that we all feel that way on some level. But I can't, as a reporter and editor for the New York Times, I can't tip over into making a value judgment about who. I just got to acknowledge that we are fractured, and that it is my contention that food and culture can make things better so long as we consume it together and listen to one another more than we talk. And so that requires me to model the behavior that I would like to see at the nation's dinner tables, which is, talk about times arrogance. But sorry, but it's my gig. I got to think about it somehow. And this is how I think about it. That my fantasy for an American meal in any part of the country with any group of people is that we're going to acknowledge where we're at as a nation in this world. We're going to celebrate the movies and the songs and the poems that we have discovered and want to share. And we're going to talk about those, and we're going to listen to one another, and we're going to eat this delicious food. See you, the next day, see you on Wednesday. I mean, seriously, it's very hard to complain about my job because it's one of the great jobs in American journalism. But Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, repeat with that newsletter, 700 words a pop, always you got to see the tears of the clown. It's dark.
And after writing all those newsletters, are you really cooking every single night?
I do have to. So as restaurant critic, I ate out 6 to 7 nights a week for years, which it sounds great. It's punishing. It's like death by massage. But I made a deal with my kids, a deal that I think worked out pretty well, which was that I would give them a home-cooked breakfast I worked nights, but I would give them a home-cooked breakfast every morning, even if I was like in sunglasses and eating Advils. They would get that meal. And so it was pretty easy when I started this gig to kind of reverse the polarity a little bit. And now I do cook most nights because I have a lot of recipes. There's no like Taco Tuesday in my house, although I market that like crazy in my newsletters, because I've always got to be testing something new. It's always, and then we have these no recipe recipes on Wednesday, and that's a flight of fancy that you got to cook. So yeah, I'm cooking a lot.
You're cooking a lot. No Trader Joe's or Grubhub.
No, Trader Joe's. They just sell prepared. That's like a Circle K for fancy people.
All right, I got to get my act together. So.
I like Circle K.
So I like this idea writ large of the newsletter and of the app, of the idea of the nation's dining table. You talk about your family meal. You've written about Thanksgiving. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the importance of convening around the table. Writ large, obviously, is the nation for that dialogue, but and how that family meal is so important.
Well, I take a slightly wider look. I put a slightly bigger lens on the notion of a family dinner. I did write a book about Thanksgiving. It's called It's really bossy. It's called Thanksgiving: How to Cook It Well, and in it, I'm making a kind of argument for convening the meal in a particular way with particular, like, this is just a bit, like, I make no judgments about your Thanksgiving. I'm just saying if you want to make it well, this is how you do it. So, so then I got to thinking, because I love Thanksgiving, and we have, I've had 35 people in a house that can only fit 10, and had these amazing meals for years. And I got to thinking, like, why is it that we only do this once a year? There are cultures in the United States where the family meal, the Sunday supper, or the Shabbat dinner, or whatever, is inviolate. Well, what if my family started to convene not Thanksgivings and not Sunday dinners in the religious, or Shabbat dinners in the religious sense, but started to convene a table, and that people could come to that table on a kind of regular cadence, so often that they knew it was kind of happening. You having Sunday dinner? Yeah, we're having Sunday dinner. Come by. My friends in town from Scranton, bring them, and bring people together around a table. I say weekly, but twice a month, what have you. The joy that you feel, if you feel joy at Thanksgiving, the joy that you can feel at Thanksgiving, could then be introduced into your life more regularly. And that the business of sitting down with others to talk and consume food could maybe bring joy and maybe even some understanding and help to those. People are hungry. Let's feed them.
You wrote, Sam, you have a new book coming out, See You on Sundays. But I was really taken by, and I look forward to reading it this spring, I think it comes out.
February. See You on Sunday. Pre-order.
But I think it's what you're touching on is really for all of us as sort of what the wanting to convene, wanting to talk, and you wrote that there's palpable loneliness out there, and that the act of bringing people around the table will sort of feed that need, so to speak. But it's interesting in this time of media silos and division, and how you are writing this book, how food will bring people together. What do you think the role of technology? I mean, here you are, the great help of technology in sharing all the great stories, but it also is an alienating force as well.
It absolutely is. And I think that eating dinner together helps fight that alienating force. And it's not easy to do, as anyone who has a child who's an adolescent can tell you. It's hard to get those phones out of people's hands. It's hard to break free of the tyranny of social media or the NFL or whatever it is, whatever screen you're staring at, and emptying your soul in exchange for dopamine. Maybe. So the table helps break that, and it's hard to do. And maybe it's not necessary that this family dinner, this regular dinner, happens in your home, right? It can happen in community groups. It can happen in churches. I have a buddy I grew up with in Brooklyn, who's now an Episcopal priest, and there was no chance that was going to happen when we were kids. This came out of left field for all of us, and particularly maybe for him. But he asked me. He said, "Listen, I know what we've been talking about the regular dinners, and he'd been coming. And he said, listen, why don't you start coming down on Sunday afternoons and just cook a meal." Just put some stuff in a pot. I got a rice cooker. We'll do it. It'll be fine. Like, nobody cares. It'll be great. So we started doing this. I started dragging the kids along. And there could not have been a more diverse population being served by these meals. Local homeless, people drifting out of 12-step programs and into the parish hall, young families, super elderly block residents and the like. 30, 40 people at a pop. Really easy after an initial night of terrors and figuring out how to cook, but ultimately pretty easy to make a stew or make something and some rice and a salad. And boy, oh boy, look, my kid got into COA off this stuff. Like the learning to see what happened to my children who really weren't into being in that environment, but to watch what happened as they sat between the homeless Polish guy and the woman who's struggling with her sobriety and the artist from down the street, and then 3 kids whose first names they know but not their last names, and they're eating the stew and then we get ice cream and go home. I thought that was transformative, and I thought that message could go far beyond that community and out into the world in a way that could materially make our lives better, whether we're doing it for 4 people in a walk-up apartment somewhere or whether we're doing it under a big tent.
So it's interesting, we were talking earlier that in cultural programs we have been working in culinary diplomacy, and we'll be doing more going forward, sending chefs overseas, not to show the diversity of different kinds of cooking here in the United States, but also cooking as entrepreneurism and the business of cooking. But I'd be curious what you think, because you were saying, does it work in a forum of cultural exchange? Right. And I'd be curious, you seem to think not.
Well, I push back on it a little bit, and here's why. I think that the business of being a chef, an American chef abroad, is very different from the experience of delivering American cuisine to other cultures, or exploring the question of American cuisine with other nations and cultures. And I reckon that it doesn't happen so much in the professional kitchen as it does in the home one. And so I like the idea that, I'm not sure how to operationalize it, but I like the idea of the great cooks of Mount Desert Island and the great cooks of Charleston, South Carolina, and Sacramento, California. And there are individuals in those communities who are expressing the kind of regional excellence of their kitchens in ways that I think could tell a great story about America to the rest of the world. There are very few chefs we have who can do that, with the exception of maybe like David Chang.
Yeah,
he could do it. Send him.
Okay. But in other words, making it more relatable.
Yes, making it more relatable, making it more real, and making it, instead of having this artist magician whose souffles rise at the wave of a wand, instead of that, making an argument about American cuisine that celebrates the fact that there is no such thing, or that it exists only as the product of immigration from hundreds of other countries around the world, and that the amalgam of them, the way a Hmong family celebrates Thanksgiving, changes our understanding of the turkey in a way that is maybe super helpful to our relationship with the French. I don't know, but I'd like to find out.
Yeah, well, keep you updated as we do more.
The Chang thing's going to work.
Okay, all right. You're going to help me get him.
Yeah,
right?
I'll get him.
Awesome. So going back before this extraordinary time that you've had at the New York Times, you were a teacher.
Yes.
For 4 years, I read, in social studies. And how do you think, what did that look like, and how do you think that time now informs what you do now?
So I couldn't get a journalism job. I would try to get all these newspaper jobs, and I was getting rejected everywhere. I got the job at American Heritage magazine, which is incredible, fantastic, wonderful narrative, kind of old-fashioned almost, but just a great place to work, until it got a little boring, and I went back on the grind, and I tried to get a newspaper job, and it wasn't working. And the New York City public schools were in trouble at that point, and someone told me they'll take anybody. So I went and got a job. I was like 23 years old, and I was assigned as a social studies teacher to Bushwick High School, on the border of Queens, in a very tough neighborhood that had gone through a lot of strife and a lot of arson, and there were a lot of open wounds in the neighborhood, and a terrible scourge of crack cocaine still. And I got there, and it was revelatory to me and very helpful to me moving forward as a journalist, because it informed me, and in no uncertain terms, that I was the whitest guy in the world. Like, there were 2 Mormon kids who were on bikes going around, and then there was me. And I had 5 classes a day with the school. It's about 50% Hispanic, 50% or 25% African American, 25% African Caribbean, and me. And I loved it. I loved the fact that my embrace of who I was and their embrace of who allowed this cultural exchange to happen while I was, teach. It's difficult to describe how those curricula worked, but the chance to just celebrate difference together, I think, lifted the students up, and I'm still in touch with a bunch of those kids. They're not kids, they're grown men and women. Allowed us to celebrate difference together and move forward united. And that has been super helpful to me as a journalist, because I'm not going into any situation as if I know what I'm talking about. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm just asking questions, writing down the responses, recording the responses, and then figuring out, at least in this gig, figuring out how to cook it together.
And how did you go then from teaching to writing about food? What is sort of that, how did that happen?
I got a job as a lot of journalists of my generation did it in an alternative newspaper. That is to say, they were like blogs before there were blogs. These were the papers that existed in opposition to the mainstream rag. So in Boston, the Phoenix hated the Globe, and New York Press, where I worked, hated the Village Voice and the Times. And it was great because it was irresponsible and knuckleheady, and we were just kids with backpacks who were mad about everything, and the Voice with all these dirty old hippies. It was so awesome. And if any of it existed digitally, I would not be here. I'd be scooping ice cream somewhere. It was deeply irresponsible. But it was, and we had a circulation at our height of 100,000, which is a tiny number in New York. And by contrast, the newsletter has 3 million. So we had 100,000 people, and most of them below 14th Street, and most of them probably under the age of 25. And so they were only really interested in food, drinks, music, sex, repeat. And I kind of drew the food gig there. And so I just kind of covered downtown restaurants while doing a lot of other stuff. And that kind of held me in good stead all the way through.
Which is fantastic for us. It's interesting, when Johnny started writing about food, he was always interested in food, as evidenced by his great belly.
Big fella.
Which my brother and I rudely named his belly, Eugene.
Eugene could eat.
He could eat. But when he started, obviously, his career in Albany, and then went overseas and covered the Vietnam War, came back, covered politics. And then it was really his time in London when he started writing about food and travel. And then seriously writing about food and history. But, at times he got pushback from that.
Yeah, he certainly did.
And was criticized for that. And Ultimately now, it's recognized what he was trying to do, but have you had that, or do you think that it's changed now, that landscape of
Honestly, I think thanks to Johnny, I don't get that pushback. There's, this notion, I mean, if you're going to write about American food, there is no better job to have than to be a roving political correspondent, right? You're all over the country, and you're not cooking in your motel room, or in Johnny's case, palatial hotel room. You're going to a restaurant, and so you get this great sense of the city. And then if you're a curious journalist, and no one was more curious than Johnny, you're gathering information about the places that you are, because these inform the dispatches that you're sending back about the political scene. But then at a certain point, you know a lot about Cincinnati, or you know a lot about London or Paris, and you know a lot about these restaurants, and you try and figure out a way to tell the story of that city through its food, or that region through its wine, and Johnny was great at that. The ability to toggle back and forth was pioneered by him, and it was my great fortune to sit at his knee, because when I became national editor, I was then filing from around the country on foods and food trends and the like, but also encouraging our reporters to understand that food was a vital part of their beat. So while I think there used to be a big divide between the A book, the serious international, national, and metropolitan news, and the op-ed page that's in the first section of the legacy newspaper, and the feature sections that followed, that's become increasingly muddled, both in practice and in fact, when you now, more than 50% of us are reading it all on our phones anyway. And so it kind of goes back and forth.
Go back and forth. So going back to this idea of bringing people together at the table with so many choices of recipes and coverage that we have, how, to what Lynn was talking about earlier, is how do we, in a successful dinner, what is that in your mind? How to handle dissent? Is it a time for argument, or how do you personally navigate that? And then I would like to open it up to questions,
Sure.
but it seems to be a very...
To my mind, dissent at the dinner table is the province of children who don't like foods that touch, or will only eat white. That's the most powerful dissent I face. The question of how, and I kind of mean that sincerely, because the thing of it is, you are not going to change anyone's mind at this dinner that we're talking about. It's not going to happen. People believe what they believe, and they're talking about what they're talking about, and arguing with them in that moment in real time, particularly if they're related to you and you've heard this a million times, is going to lead to heartache. What I think, and I'm a voluble fellow, what I think is we need to listen more. That not interrupting, not disagreeing, but simply listening, particularly to stuff we don't agree with, and maybe asking questions that are prompts to learn more, rather than asking questions that are designed to belittle or to poke, is a better use of our time. I have seen awful, terrible behavior at my dinner tables over the years. And I'm not just talking about my brother. No. My brothers are awesome. But no, they really are. But what I like to do in that case is to just maybe this is the journalist in me, is to bring myself up to like 30,000 feet and look down and see how hilarious it is, or how much of a picture of where we are right now it is. I suppose I'm the furthest thing from a historian, but I imagine this is what historians at their best can do, is to put themselves up so high that they can see the machinations that are undetectable by the participants down below. also doing that relieves you of some of the stress and anger you're feeling at this idiot spouting off about whatever he's spouting or she is spouting off about.
So when you're planning your dinner parties, are you the sheer act of convening? Are you thinking about, oh, let's have a conversation about this and bring in people from the art?
No. I've been to a few of those where it's like, okay, the Sauterne is out, and what do you think about Syria? And you're like, oh boy, here we go.
Not a fan of table talk.
No. I mean, it can be very. I mean, it depends on, I suppose, who you have at the table. It could be kind of interesting, but oftentimes, like really, we got through the whole meal. Now we're going to talk politics. What I do like to do, because I like strangers, I like there to be an element of surprise, is that I like to the extent that I'm not a control freak. I'm a control freak. But I like people to sit with people they don't know super well. Spouses should not sit together, little cliques should not sit together. I think spreading it out a little bit and trying to not curate the conversation in any way, but provide the best possible scenario by which magic could happen, that sparks could fly in a good way or maybe in a bad way. But I think if you have a diverse enough group and no one is too tight with one another necessarily, I mean, obviously we're all friends, but like I haven't seen that person in a long time, put them there. Something interesting could happen. And isn't that what we're looking for in life always? That something interesting could happen?
Absolutely. Love to open it up to questions. I'm sure there are quite a lot. So. Lynn, how do you want to do? Are there microphones or?
There appear to be microphones.
Okay.
Because we're live streaming. So.
Hello. I was brought up in the sort of pre-feminist era in which women, whether they had servants working with them or they did it themselves, they spent a great deal of time handling table management. Who sat where? We just went and saw James Madison's home in Montpelier, and learned a lot about how Dolly Madison managed their table, which was a glorious and highly recommended table. Thomas Jefferson, which we saw the same weekend, he had people arranged in little tete-a-tetes all over his dining room, whereas Dolly Madison had the large oak reef dining room table that we think of today. And I've also learned during my early feminist days a great deal about the Jane Austens of this world and even the Edith Whartons, how they handled table or conversations, which were just like my grandmother or my great-grandmother or my mother. Their way of handling arguments was not to suppress them or quell them, but to pull out, they didn't argue hypothesis, antithesis, synthesis, like most of us academically trained people. They learned to deftly weave side lays, find little small parts of the conversation that people could enjoy that would bring out, in many places, bigger insights. There's a whole art of conversation.
Yep. And now dudes can do it too. Progress.
So, in a way, that was the point of view that I had.
Thank you.
The second thing I wanted to say is most of my stressed out friends with messy households deal with potluck suppers or potluck meals, and I wanted to know, how does that fit in?
Oh, they're potlucks are just tremendous, unless you're a control freak. In which case, they're stressful. Who's controlling the question?
Thank you so much for coming today. As a native New Yorker and current resident in DC, I really appreciate your political dissent at the table. However, my basic problem at the table now is vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free, lactose intolerant.
Yes.
How?
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
This is the new dissent. What are they after? What do they want? These neo, paleo, vegan. I'm allergic to pepper. No, you're not. Yes, it's enormously difficult. I think that the most successful expressions of dinner parties and the like are when the people love food and they want to be there. And I make awesome vegetarian food and put it on the table all the time. And I'm willing to accept that you're gluten-free now for 10 minutes since your sophomore year. And we'll try, but at a certain point, it's gonna like friendships end. It's hard to keep it going. I welcome the stranger always, but at a certain point, like we have unleaded and diesel. That's what.
Gentleman back there.
Good morning. Since we're talking about diplomacy, have you learned anything about state dinners at the White House or at other places, and how food can aid or not aid communication that's on sort of the public stage?
Yeah, I think the state dinner is one of the great opportunities of any presidential administration to communicate the kind of inclusive, brilliant deliciousness of American cuisine. Unfortunately, the coverage of those dinners has been, I mean, let's go, like, I'm making jokes about guys involved in this stuff, and I'm saying like how it's a golden age for writing about politics and writing about food at the same time. But the fact of the matter is that if I would like to be able to cover state dinners in exactly the way that you're asking about them, and this White House and the Obama White House make that virtually impossible. And I would like to make great arguments about how far forward we've come, and we're past sexism, blah, blah. But you know what? Writing about state dinners, they treat that as like, that's ladies' pages stuff. And you can't actually ask serious questions about the cuisine. You can't actually do real reporting about how the seating has been affected, what wines are poured and where. They just release this thing like a menu. And then like stenographers were supposed to report that this is what Prime Minister Modi ate or whatever. And I think that's a real shame. I would like to pledge in front of all of you that we're going to work hard. I think it's a lost cause with this administration, but in future administrations, we're going to work hard to kind of break down the lace curtain and get to the guts of the state dinner, because I think it is a high expression of American culture on an international stage.
Great. Question back there in the far back.
Can you peer into the future? You did a great job kind of illustrating how they've changed over the last 20 to 30 years. Give us what you think restaurants are what role they're going to play in society, in our daily lives over the next 20 years, maybe 20 years from now.
Wow. Where's the envelope? What did he do, the envelope? So there's some interesting things happening. One is we're cooking more at home. We may be cooking more at home because the economy isn't as bright as we think it is, and we need to. We may be cooking more at home because I'm doing my job the way I think I should be. Restaurant sales are in a weird place. They're kind of doing better on fast casual type places that are also serving better food than they ever have in the past. These essentially like bowl restaurants that serve you a salad from chickens who went to Oberlin. Those places are doing very well, and they're growing. The fast food places are hurting. McDonald's is they're hoping they can maybe make a run with Impossible Meats and the like, but the fast food, junk food places are hurting. The mid-level fast casual places are doing quite well. And then in the world of fine dining, some really interesting stuff is happening. One, the fine dining isn't so fine. There are no more tablecloths, and we sit in rustic places, and everything's in a mason jar. And that's great. And it's great because while I bemoan the sameness of it all, there's no such thing as like fine dining food desert. There are food deserts in this country, and we haven't talked about food insecurity at all, and that's a shame. It's a real and important issue in the United States. But for people who want to go out and have a nice bottle of Chablis and some icy cold shellfish, we're at a high water mark in the United States. The cities that never had great restaurant scenes have incredible restaurant scenes. If you took Portland today and put it on the island of Manhattan 20 years ago, we'd be writing stories about it, about this, what's happening in New York. It's the greatest restaurant city in the world. Portland's doing great. LA, I think, outstrips New York for quality of its restaurants right now. And I think that as long as there are people who coming up who want to start businesses and can seek the financing and get it, that's going to be good for restaurants. It's not going to be good for restaurants in New York City, and eventually not in Chicago or LA because of rents. If you come and visit us in New York City today, you'll see all the restaurants that we're reviewing that are opening, that people are talking about with flash chefs. They're all on the second floor of a hotel, or they're anchoring a new development downtown. And when you go to these restaurants, you could be anywhere. You could be in Dubai. You could be in Vancouver, and that's a shame. I hope that stops. And the way, whether it does or whether it doesn't, we now have a world, or we now have a country in which people can return home to their beautiful places, open restaurants, and have them be a success, because we love food and it defines us.
Mm. Elizabeth, right there.
Hi, I come from a place, San Francisco, where restaurants are having trouble, and I wanted you to speak to you started to speak to that. It's fostering some new ideas of eating out where you serve yourself in the restaurant, because they can't find staff. And then
they can't find staff. Well, they can't find
claim.
staff because the rents are so freaking high.
Right.
So San Francisco, which has destroyed its restaurant scene because of tech money, is in this position where you can't hire anybody to work in your restaurant because they have to live in like LA to get to get to where they're going. So what's the restaurant going to do? Well, they just get rid of the servers, and they give you a little stick with a number on it, like you're at Chuck E. Cheese, and then you go and get your own silverware and whatever, and then they bring you some pretty good food that you've served yourself and eaten.
And you clean up.
And then you bust your stuff, and then they give it to a robot to clean it, and somebody's like, oh, it's Uber for cleanup, and you're just like, these guys are ruining society by jacking these rents up. The issue in it's amazing to me. San Francisco was such a vital and interesting food scene for so long, from Chez Panisse onward. And its relationship to the Napa Valley was so beautiful, and it was farm to table in this interesting, four-season way, and fantastic restaurants were opening left and right. Now it's really, really hard to do that because rents are so high for the restaurants, rents are so high for the workers, and the disruptive bros in Silicon Valley are literally disrupting the business to make it so that it's all automated, and they can just eat from their gerbil thing.
And you may have restaurants in hotels. We have restaurants in corporations.
Yeah, exactly.
And so all those vast number of workers don't go out to,
don't
eat at home, and they don't go out.
You stay on campus, there's dry cleaning there, there's a gym, there's a little sleeping nook.
So then my question is, what is your responsibility as a journalist?
To tell that story.
To tell that story, but also the parallel development of real food insecurity in those communities.
Yeah, so it's a great argument for a few more reporters, because we have to do two things at once. One, and Kim Severson, my colleague who's based in Atlanta but is a national correspondent for the food desk of the Times, has done a good job, I think, of beginning to to outline this trouble in San Francisco and from whence it emanates. Figuring out how to cover food insecurity is a really tricky one for the Times, because I acknowledge it. I write about it in the newsletter. It's there, it's part of who we are. But my question is, should I be pushing for a reporter to cover that in the world of national reporting? And I think the answer is yes, more than having it intrude on what is an aspirational area of the newspaper that's meant to give you a break. So it'd be very hard for me to, look, here's a 4-star review of a restaurant on 56th Street, and then below it, look at how this food desert has become a real issue in South Central Los Angeles. I got to keep those apart while recognizing that our readers are going to read both. I just need to use a term from earlier today, curate that more sensibly.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Right here. Just gentleman, and then this lady, sorry, and this gentleman, sorry.
Hi. Thank you so much. This is wonderful, and I'm very addicted to New York Times cooking. Print, app, everything.
Great.
I assume you're familiar with the editorial that Frank Bruni wrote a few months ago called The Best Restaurant If You're Over 50.
Yes.
And I really identified with that editorial, and I was wondering if you'd comment a little bit on that.
Sure. So my colleague Frank Bruni, who's now on the op-ed page, but who was the restaurant critic for the New York Times for many years, wrote this column that now in the world of search engine optimization, the headline is the story. I don't need to explain it. It's the best restaurant for when you're over 50. And that is the one where, just to boil it down to the Cliff Notes version, you can be heard, where you're comfortable, and where where the food is what you want to eat. Frank, of course, in addition to being over 50, has a history that, like mine, saw him in restaurants 6 nights a week for years. And the best restaurant for anyone of any age is the one where you're a regular, where you like to be. And you probably like to be there because you can be heard and you have your regular order. And Frank, for years, had no regular order, same as me. I would dream of a plate of overdone chicken wings and a Budweiser so cold it had flecks of ice in it. And nope, foie gras again. Like it, so what I think that column was about, I think it was a brilliant column and it resonated across, I mean, people loved it because it was true. But what I think resonates is we long to be taken care of in our restaurant going experience. We long to be recognized. We long to be pampered even a little bit. And for sure, we want to be able to hear one another and have the experience of joy in the place without the tinnitus of loud music or people shouting. I hate the people shouting.
We have another question right here.
Just to reinforce a point you made earlier on, we were 35 years ago in Monopoli, Italy, with my adopted son, Judy and I, and our adopted son who's 6 years old, asking for directions. And in 5 minutes, we were invited to a birthday party for his daughter, also of the same age, which started at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
and I thought this was really bizarre. And there at a very long table, we found a great number of people, but all adults, and this one daughter and our son. And after a great meal, the host came up and said, "Do you know how we evaluate a great dinner?" And I said, "How?" He said, "By the number of people at the table."
Oh, that's great.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, we got to stop there.
Yeah.
We're stopping. That is with Stanley
Those kids are married now.
That was wonderful.
Sam's book that he's been hawking all morning is for sale up at the table, as is Christina Baker Klein's, Imbolo Mbue's, Sheila Canby's. So go on back and we'll see you there. Thank you all for coming this morning. See you tomorrow at 9:30.
Thanks. That was fun. That was real, thank you.